everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Daniella Cheslow, and Dr. Dania Thafer has kindly invited me to moderate this panel. I'm a deputy tech editor at Politico. And today we're going to be talking about Trump's Gulf tour. President Donald Trump is back from his first multi-day overseas trip of his second term. His visit through 3 Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, was a break from the typical presidential foreign journey. He promised commerce, not chaos. He signed giant economic and security deals with Gulf nations and with American business executives, especially from the tech industry, by his side. So on today's panel, we're going to take a look at the stakes of Trump's Gulf tour. We'll examine how the high-profile investments, AI partnerships, and arms deals are reshaping relations between the U.S. and the Gulf and influencing the global power balance. This tour comes at a critical time for the Gulf. It's emerging as a vital node in the race for AI, semiconductors, and critical minerals, with an appetite to diversify its economy away from oil. Trump has said he secured close to $2 trillion in investment commitments from the 3 nations, and the trip showed Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE making the case for closer ties to the U.S. while tensions rise with China and Russia. On today's panel, we'll discuss how Trump's travels are playing out domestically. We'll also talk about what the trip might indicate for the Middle East as a region, including normalization with Israel, the containment of Iran, and Syria's post-conflict reconstruction. In all, this Gulf tour added up to dramatic shifts in the U.S. approach to the region and could be a test and an indicator of Washington's ability to lead in the new global order. So, we have some great people on the panel to get into those questions. I'll start with Dr. Thafer. She's the executive director of the Gulf International Forum, which is our host and an institute based in Washington, D.C. that provides analysis on political, economic, social, and security issues for the 6 Gulf cooperation countries, along with Iran, Iraq, and Yemen. She's also a professorial lecturer at the School of Foreign Services Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. Her expertise is on the Gulf region's security, U.S. Gulf relations, and the political economy of the GCC states. Next, we have Brian Katulis. He's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, and he was formerly a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he built its Middle East program and also worked on broader issues related to U.S. national security. And Brian worked in the National Security Council and the State Department during the Clinton administration. And next to him on the panel is Professor David Roches. He's associate professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Security Studies, as well as a senior non-resident fellow at the Gulf International Forum. Prior to that, he was the Defense Department's director responsible for policy concerning Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, the UAE, and Yemen. And before that, he served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as liaison to the Department of Homeland Security, as country director for Pakistan, as NATO operations director, and deputy director for peacekeeping. So,
not all at the same.
We have quite a lot of expertise, quite a lot of years of experience on this panel. And so I'd like to kick us off by turning to you, Dr. Thafer. Let's start kind of broadly. When you look at the Gulf tour, how does this visit reshape the trajectory of U.S. Gulf relations, especially in light of the evolving regional priorities and the shifting security and economic alignments?
Thank you very much, Daniella, for the question and for moderating. Well, I think, generally speaking, U.S. Gulf relations are pretty strong. They have strong, especially in terms of security relations. I think what made this trip particularly stand out is how the U.S. reclaimed leadership, let's say, in technology when it comes to the Gulf, and also diplomacy, because I think from the region's perspective, the U.S. kind of took a less active role over the course of the couple of years. From the Gulf states, what's really important for them to position themselves as a global hub for innovation. And I have to say, this is probably the most important takeaway for the 3 Gulf Cooperation Council countries, especially Saudi and the UAE. And what's really important for them is to be able to leapfrog into artificial intelligence and different technologies. And this is something that the Gulf states have missed throughout their development trajectory. I mean, they passed over, the Industrial Revolution, the Internet Revolution, and so now it's an opportunity for them to localize innovation in their countries. So I think that's the big takeaway for the Gulf states. Something very interesting from the perspective of the U.S. is, the Gulf yet again was the first stop. First foreign visit. The fact that, like, I was just in Germany last week, Europe is very upset, saying we don't get enough attention. The fact, I mean, Asia isn't usually the place where where a president would stop, but if you think about it, the Gulf is the only place where the U.S. president could extract these kind of investments. And for Trump, this is where it counts the most, because for him, he wants to appear as, the deal maker, the one that brings jobs to the U.S. And I think that was really important for his base, specifically with the backdrop of the tariff war with China. And, obviously that raises economic concerns here in the U.S. And so I think this is where it stood out the most. And I think another aspect of the relationship is very interesting. Daniella and I were talking. She mentioned how usually, oil company execs would be the highlight of visits to the Gulf, but this time it was tech execs. It's almost like this capital for access sort of diplomacy, which is very different, I think, than U.S. diplomacy in the past. So I think that's something interesting. Another point I would like to highlight is really the Gulf states, they're looking to be more partners and co-architects for the future order of the Middle East, and also playing a pretty large role as the global order changes. And I think that also makes this trip particularly interesting. So they're not looking to be just clients, if you will, but shareholders in their relationship with the U.S. And I think that's something that's new and interesting. And I don't think that Trump's trip was just about securing deals. I mean, I know that's what we see the most in the headline, but I think it's about showing that America is important for the future global order, and technology, and countering China, which will be my next set of remarks. I don't want to burn my next remarks. So going through state by state, Trump, as you all are probably very much aware, that he visited Qatar, Kuwait. Sorry. I'm biased towards Kuwait because my background. Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia's trip was very interesting because I think, based on one takeaway that speaking to so many scholars and perspectives, it really emerged as the economic and military anchor in the Arab world. And I think it showed that it had significant leverage in a Trump-led Washington. So we saw that there were many deals, the $600 billion investment pledge, discussions about civil nuclear programs were reopened. Defense deal, which is supposedly, it's touted as the largest defense deal, worth $142 billion. And something interesting to me is discussions about critical minerals. I thought that was a very interesting perspective, especially with the backdrop of China trying to chokehold the U.S. in terms of critical minerals. And we saw in terms of AI and tech, really important movements. Saudi Arabia launched Humane, an AI firm that is supposed to be the cornerstone of its global AI hub, and one of the important companies in terms of the localization of technology. And I also want to highlight the importance of these deals is that the Gulf states are looking for knowledge transfer. They're just not looking for a client-based relationship, and that's important for their innovation-led development. If you can read my book, I talk about the politics of innovation in the Gulf states. And you can't forget that the large youth bulge, which is an incredibly important period for productivity. And if they miss this period, in the future, it's going to be economically very difficult for the Gulf states with a large age population and a smaller number of youth. So that's something to underscore. So in terms of Qatar, now Qatar did focus on tech and to a certain degree and other issues, but Qatar also focused on its soft power and being that small state with global diplomatic reach. And so, as you know, for Qatar, mediation is not, simply just a policy. It's a strategic identity for Qatar. For them, it makes them a reliable U.S. partner. It protects their energy and economic interests and gives them diplomatic capital globally. And so I think what Qatar was looking for in this trip was to secure U.S. recognition as its role as a regional and global mediator. And this is why they focused on Gaza, and this is why they focused on talking about the Iran nuclear deals. Iran nuclear deal, even though there were deals. And they were happy to be at the forefront of the release of the hostage Eden Alexander, but I think there was a strong disappointment in terms of, as you all may know, that there were so many rumors about a ceasefire discussion, a ceasefire deal being announced, and that didn't happen. Now, I'm not sure how much of a rumor that was, but I think there was disappointment in that regards. But again, Qatar agreed for an economic exchange of 1.2 trillion, which I don't think was announced in advance, but announced once Trump arrived there. And a $10 billion upgrade to Al Udeid base. And I think that's important for solidifying their security relations with the U.S., of course. And we have Dave DeRoche here, who's the defense expert. He'll talk more about it. And they talked about university partnerships and tech initiatives. The UAE, and this is my last one, has really positioned itself as like the Silicon Valley of the Arab world. As always, they display that they're agile, they're influential, and they're future-facing. They've agreed to a $1.4 trillion investment into the U.S. and were very successful in achieving their tech ambitions, whether it be cloud or AI infrastructure. They had deals with Microsoft, Amazon, Oracle, NVIDIA. I think you told me that there is a rumor of almost 1 million chips for the UAE, so that's quite significant. But in all of these cases, I did want to say something that I didn't mention, that there was soft power engagement as well, trying to bring in soft power influence in terms of tourism and investments across all of them, whether it be UAE having Disney, which I'm pretty excited about. I think Qatar, there's a talk about Universal Studios. I've read, but that's probably not something solidified as of yet. And so I think it's very interesting how U.S. is also trying to push forward its soft power through these sort of cultural engagements. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I wanted to turn next to Brian. We're hearing from Dania here about the broad outlines of these big deals, but we also saw the president making dramatic announcements while he was on this trip, talking about lifting sanctions on Syria, offering an olive branch to Iran. Is there a through line between these moves and the new agreements that Trump was signing with these Gulf countries? What do you see?
I hope so, and thank you for hosting us here. Thanks for having me on a panel. We've done work before. I'm at the Middle East Institute, but I think this is the first time I've been on a panel here. I'm Brian Katulis, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute. I'm also host of the podcast Taking the Edge Off the Middle East. If you're not listening to it, today we just had the episode with Dennis Ross drop, and it's a series of casual conversations with policymakers from the region, ex-policymakers, and things like that. I hope there's a connectivity between these issues on what I call the Silver Linings Playbook, which I actually think was well executed as a public relations and strategic communications exercise. Very, very smooth. And this was the third presidential trip to the Gulf that I think has gone relatively smoothly. The optics look really, really good. The previous two being Trump's first visit to the Gulf in 2017, if you remember the glowing orbs and the sword dances. I was sort of disappointed there was no glowing orb in Saudi Arabia. We got to get them on that. It was pretty cool. And then Biden. People often forget that Biden himself, and I've written about this, went almost kicking and screaming, I would say, to the Gulf, because when he ran, and I remember this, I was at the Center for American Progress, the center left think tank, progressive place, talking about the Gulf in the way that you're talking about the Gulf today and we are today, verboten. It was sort of crazy talk because everything had become red versus blue in our politics. And Biden himself said that MBS is a pariah. But lo and behold, by the summer of 2022, Biden went not to Qatar and the UAE, but he did go to Saudi Arabia and signed a series of deals that, to me as an analyst, we often forget in our hyper-partisan and ideological context that a lot of the things that were articulated by Trump in the Silver Linings Playbook, spring bling trip, if you want to call it that. A lot of these things were not new ideas. These were ideas in some ways that were resurfaced by Trump 1.0, that were originated in Trump 1.0. But then importantly, the framework in the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia under Biden, right? And a lot of the things on space race, technology, AI, these things were under discussion. So in our hyper-partisan to the moment here in this country, we often forget the thing that you teach undergraduates in U.S. Foreign Policy 101 is that continuity is more the norm between administrations, even with a disruptive administration like Trump that wants to break all conventions and certainly has, and things like that. But to your question, and I'll be more precise about it, is that I hope that there's a linkage between the regional security moves, the plays that Trump has put on the field in the first couple of months. I do, in addition to the podcast, a quarterly assessment, and it's got a report card. I used to do this for the Biden team. I used to get calls from top officials. For those of you who are still students, I would get calls from top officials saying our grade should be like a B plus, not a C. And it's funny what people fixate on. To be clear, and there's copies of this report downstairs if you want to get it on the way out. This was issued before the trip. And one of the categories was managing relations with key partners. And in the first 3 months, I gave them a below average C minus score, in part because if you look at the treatment of partners across the region, Jordan, Egypt, the sort of bluster of strategic communications that is uncertain that comes from Trump, which, by the way, was under wraps on this trip. It was pretty tight. He sent the message of reassurance. But 3 big things, and you mentioned Syria already, but I'll add 2 to it. Syria, Palestine, and Iran. These are the 3 things that during this trip, one of the 3 was more optimistic and brighter than the other. Syria, first of all, I was surprised. I mean, I knew people were working on this behind the scenes, but if you look at policy in the way that I try to, which is in part look at personnel, and if you recall just 2-3 days before the president's visit, Sebastian Gorka, who is a very influential figure in this White House on counterterrorism. And I don't think he likes a lot of these Gulf states, and he certainly doesn't like the Syrian leadership, because if you look at the interview he did in Shark, which is a major Saudi outlet, with Hibba Nasser, it seemed to me this was an administration signaling they weren't going to go in the direction that President Trump did. And he did, and I agree with the strategic thrust of it, that the 3 pillars of security in the region today, there's many more, but the 3 big ones are Syria, Palestine, and Iran. And if Syria can actually get the support that it needs, and it was not getting the support, 5-6 months after its transition, there was a hesitancy there. If you recall, when the Assad regime fell in December, the Biden team very quickly sort of put a carrots with the dangling of removing of sticks framework to incentivize the Syrian government. The initial response of then President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect Vance on Syria was, we're going to stay the hell out. They're not. They're actually hearing from their Gulf partners, Saudis and others, saying we need to lift these sanctions and move quickly. But that's still very much, as you know, in the U.S. system, a work in progress. I believe Secretary of State Rubio was just on the Hill talking about it. So Syria is number 1. I'll go more briefly in the other 2. On Iran, I gave the administration in my report card pre-trip B. And I was sort of surprised in that they had gone through 3 rounds of talks, and I was in Oman on the eve of the 4th round of talks that Steve Woodcock had. And I think they've pleasantly tried to pursue the path of diplomacy. we'll probably get into it here about how likely that path will succeed, and given all the different signals, because Trump is who he is. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, he says he wants peace. On Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays, he said we're going to bomb the hell out of this country if it doesn't agree to the deal. But Iran is the overarching strategic threat. If Syria is this ballast, if you will, if it hangs together, the whole Levant and the whole region can come together. Iran has been looming for decades, not just the nuclear program, but the threats that it poses to its neighbors and has posed to its neighbors to this day. And there's big question marks about whether there's an actual sort of clear game plan to deal with the full spectrum of challenges that Iran poses and the opportunities. And last but not least, but I'll be very brief, but I hope we come back to it, because I think this is the gaping wound. And part of I should have a longer bio there. I used to live in Palestine. I used to live in Gaza and the West Bank in the 1990s. And I'm one of these guys who believes it is essential to have a resolution there that is just, that is grounded in the international framework. And on this trip, while Trump was in the region, and Les does not, don't want to ignore sort of the talks. I want to hear if you know any more about the 2-hour meeting that the president had with the emir of Qatar. I want to hear more about all of the things that they're trying to construct. But as he was there, Israel was already bombing Gaza, and they're now, as we sit here today, initiating a campaign where Netanyahu said they're going to take back the whole Gaza Strip, right? And to me, this, in and of itself, it is a threat and a challenge to have this unresolved. For the Palestinian people, for the Israelis themselves, but then for the state system. So long answer to your short question is I hope there's a linkage between the geopolitical plays and the security strategy that Trump puts out and his silver linings playbook. Because if you do not have security, if you have Iran rushing headlong towards a nuclear weapon, if you have Israel embroiled in turning the corner into the third year of an endless war in Gaza, and right-wingers in that government talking about annexation of the West Bank. And if you have Syria, that again, Trump took a step in the right direction, in my view, in offering sort of an opening for the Syrian people to have a different government. If you don't have those pieces in the equation, you can talk AI, you can talk all sorts of India, Middle East, Europe economic corridors. You're going to have a very unstable foundation on which your sort of visions of a silver linings playbook will never become a reality.
It's a really interesting analysis, especially when we talk about peace in the region. I kind of wanted to flip it on the other side and talk about arms deals. And I wanted to turn to David DeRoche for that. Trump announced enormous deals that were being signed with Saudi, with Qatar, $142 billion in defense sales to Saudi Arabia, $42 billion to Qatar. How do you anticipate these moves are going to change what the GCC countries are able to do? And also, kind of speaking to Brian's point, is it kind of a signal to the Israelis that the power balance is shifting? Should they be nervous?
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Good questions. I have to start by saying that my remarks do not reflect any U.S. government policy for reasons that will soon be readily apparent to all of us. So the short answer is there is a remarkable lack of fidelity on what specifically was offered. And so I have to go off of the track record. In the last Trump administration, I did a detailed analysis. There was a little bit more fidelity. I did a detailed analysis of, I think what was billed at the time is $110 billion defense deal with Saudi Arabia. And it was a fraction of that. A lot of it was things that were recharacterized or things that were possibly under discussion, but it couldn't happen here. So we don't know how much this is, but I'd be shocked if I think that this is an upper limit estimate if all options are posted. And some of these things may already be in play and are being recharacterized. So let me, next slide. This is an extract directly from the White House communique. So it said $142 billion. I would be, as I said, shocked if it approaches $142 billion. I think that $35 billion is where I would, that's putting my chips on the red. 35 billion, I think. And they're in these 5 areas. I'll go in each of those 5 areas. Next slide. So the first is Air Force advancement and space capabilities. We do actually have a bit of fidelity on this. We know that one of these capabilities that's been discussed is the upper aircraft C-130. I have about 60 jumps out of that. Long-serving, not exactly cutting-edge technology, originally entered service in the 1960s. Extremely robust transport aircraft produced by Lockheed Martin in Georgia, key swing state. So bringing home the bacon. The fact that this is being discussed publicly indicates to me that Lockheed Martin is talking about it, which indicates to me that there is a lot of confidence in this. This is an aircraft that will provide strategic lift within a state like Saudi Arabia that has issues of time and space, needs rapid reaction. It is sustainable. It is relatively easy to incorporate given that the level of technology and the fact that there are people out there, the fact that there are generations of people who have worked on this in other air forces who can be brought in as contract maintainers. But of course, the big money are the two aircraft on the bottom. The one on the left, I guess, left as you look at it, is the F-15. There's always the last F-15 deal was consummated in 2011. That was a $60 billion deal. That was for the recapitalization upgrade of the F-15. At the time, the U.S. Air Force felt that it was going to retire the F-15 platform and move towards the V-22 and the whatever the next generation of the Joint Strike Fighter was going to be. The F-22 has not worked out that well. In large part, the plane is too good for humans to operate in. And so what we've seen is that there's been more innovation going into the more upgrades on the F-15, which has proven to be an extremely capable and robust platform. And I think that we are going to see a further recapitalization and extension of the life cycle of the Saudi F-15 program. And that would make it one of the longest running F-15 programs outside of the United States. It is a very, very capable aircraft, and I think it is, there are now generations of Saudis who have operated it. And of course, on the bottom right, the Joint Strike Fighter, which is always in the mix. I think that this is an extremely expensive aircraft, and I think that a lot of that $142 million is anticipating a future transfer of the Joint Strike Fighter. The challenge with this is there are actually security barriers to transferring this that are related to protecting stealth in the Joint Strike Fighter. So if you operate the Joint Strike Fighter in proximity to a hostile or a potential adversary that has the ability to emit any kind of electromagnetic signals, it is possible that they can build up a dictionary of the stealth signatures and thus negate the stealth. So if you have a Huawei 5G network in the area and you're flying stealth aircraft in and out regularly, over time, the operators of that will be able to compromise stealth. So this is one of the issues that led to stealth to the Joint Strike Fighter not be adopted in the United Arab Emirates. And I think that this will be an issue with the kingdom as well. So when I say that I don't think it'll be $142 billion, I think that this is a major part of the reason why. Next slide. Air and missile defense. This is probably the most straightforward one. A lot of this will go to RTX company, formerly Raytheon. The upper left-hand corner is a TPY-2 radar. This is the radar that controls the THAAD missile, which it's a RTX radar, but it's in a Lockheed Martin system. It also can be used standalone with a slight software change and is an extremely effective long-range target acquisition and homing radar. And I think there will be some sales of this. It's already been released to the kingdom as THAAD, and it is solid-state radar, so they can be produced relatively quickly, unlike the existing Patriot radar. The upper right-hand corner is the PAVE long-range air defense warning radar that's at Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And I've accompanied 3 or 4 delegations of Saudi Air Defense Forces officials to inspect the facility at Cape Cod, and I think that they're going to pull the trigger on that. The lower left-hand corner is Patriot Pack 2. The Saudis have exhausted their, or not exhausted, but they are running perilously low on missiles for existing Patriot systems. And the problem is these are not assembly line issues. They're really like crafted missiles. I know that peacetime, the rough capacity to produce these missiles was about 12 a month. The challenge is, just as the Saudi inventory was being drained, Ukraine came online, and there was a new requirement for that. So there just aren't enough missiles to go around. And expanding capacity is very hard when you have to have security cleared workforce. So I think that there will be a lot of that. And then the bottom right-hand corner, this is just a prediction based on what I know, but presumably I was asked here because I'm expected to know things, so I could be wrong. But this is the new radar for the Patriot Air Defense System called LTAMDS. It is a solid-state radar. It has superior range, superior performances, more robust than the existing radar with Patriot missile system. It has only been allowed to, it is only releasable to Poland. They're the only foreign country that has it. But I predict, and here, I said earlier with the C-130 that I put all my money on red. This is a roulette metaphor, so that's a fairly safe bet. With this, I put my money on 32 black. I have a great degree of confidence. Of course, confidence is not the same as knowledge, but I have a great degree of confidence that that LTAMDS radar is one of the things that's been released. Next slide. Maritime and coastal security. The Saudis historically have been somewhat resistant to buying ships from the United States. I think part of that is local production, part of that is technology release, part of that is the fact that there are European countries that have extremely subsidized military shipbuilding and are not subject to things like quantitative military aid. So I don't think they're going to buy surface combatants. I think what we will see are things like surveillance drones and perhaps helicopters to be used in a maritime role. And then below that ship launching it, that's the Aegis missile system. That has been a long time Saudi desire. It has not been consummated because of the relatively low priority that the Saudi Navy operates within the hierarchy, where whenever they get up to the point of buying, the funds are used for other purposes within the Saudi Ministry of Defense, and because of the fact that it is traditionally, there's been engineering issues where they want to buy it but put it on a Spanish ship, and that integration of the Aegis system with another ship is extremely difficult, extremely costly. Once you pencil it out, it just can't happen. So there might be some progress on that. I would argue that the best solution would have the Aegis system stationed ashore. And there actually is a precedent for that in Romania and Poland. We have Aegis ashore. So, and that would be good because the threat is really coming from two directions at most, Iran. Yeah, but next slide, border security and force modernization. Land forces modernization. Again, this is one I have a high degree of confidence in. I think that HIMARS missile will be released. This is a tactical to operational level long-range missile. And again, the issue here is just the fact that it's so much in demand to include the family of missiles that it can launch, including ATACMS, which have a longer range, and then also border surveillance. And I think that, again, with a high degree of surveillance, that we will see the trigger pulled on blimp-borne observation platforms used in a border security role, which is what we use on the southwest border of the United States. Next slide. Information and communication systems upgrades. The gold standard here is Link 16. The challenge with buying Link 16, which integrates aircraft, ground shooters, naval shooters, it's a whole integrated network. The problem is you buy it, and then every couple of years you have to buy upgrades. It's kind of like buying a sailing boat where you spend 25% of the purchase cost in maintenance every year. So I think there'll be that. I think there will also be some more modern software, such as Palantir software, things of that nature. What are the problems? Next slide. The first one is a lot of these require congressional approval, or at least a lack of congressional disapproval. I've written a book chapter on this that was published by the UCLA Press a while ago. Cooperation with Saudi Arabia really is an elite concern within the United States. If it happens at the State Department, the NSC, or the Department of Defense, we recognize the value of the partnership that goes through. Unfortunately, if it goes to the full Congress, if it is publicly accountable, then there is not a lot of goodwill towards the kingdom. And the picture there is of the joint the JASTA Act, which allowed citizens to sue Saudi Arabia for the 9/11 attacks. That is the only veto that was overridden by Congress in Barack Obama's 2 terms. and it was unanimous. So if this becomes an issue, if it makes it to Congress, it's going to be very, very difficult for the kingdom. And then there are people who specifically, and that's Senator Chris Murphy, who I think is one of the best examples, outspoken constituency among legislators who are hostile to uh, new acquisitions for Saudi Arabia. Now, the details of the Qataris, minor progress, the Emiratis in general, minor progress, except for the designation of a special defense relationship, which include technology aspects that Dr. Thafer spoke up. Uh, I think what we see here is a compromise where what our Gulf partners want is the Gulf standards. They want a NATO-like relationship, which shows that they don't understand how NATO works. They think it's a tripwire automatic U.S. military response to an incursion. NATO Article 5 only commits NATO members to consultations in the event of an attack, but they want something like that. That will not happen because of the reasons I just spoke under the congressional situation. And I think that we've seen the UAE already designated as a special defense partner in the first Biden term. That is a term and a status which has no basis in U.S. law or precedent. And this relationship really amounts to nothing more than a statement of good intentions, combined with some other things that are peripheral, like the designation of Texas as the Texas National Guard as a state partner of the UAE, which now joins Qatar, which is partnered with West Virginia. I don't see movement towards a formal defense pact. I think that is just a bridge too far domestically, and I think that it would not be negotiated. So what we have here is the public display of affinity and support in a manner that can be portrayed publicly as having some sort of bureaucratic heft, but in actuality does not. And that's a lot of stuff, so I welcome your most difficult questions.
Thanks for that. That might be the longest answer I've ever received to a question.
I am
Most articulated.
so sorry. So sorry.
But I did wonder, I mean, just to follow up on it, do you think this is a deal on its own or deals on their own? Or is this kind of a signal to the Israelis to lower the temperature in Gaza? Is it something that they should be worried about in terms of losing their own edge?
So good question. So I think it is divorced from Israel. And I think that this is everything. When you get to that $142 billion, I think the accounting standards, I'm using this term imprecisely, I think the accounting standards were relaxed. So I think this was viewed as a separate issue. I think that Israel always has concerns about the qualitative military edge, which the administration, I believe, shares. I think that there will be some capabilities that Israel will have issues with. This is always an issue, particularly when you talk about weapons to be in the northern part of the kingdom and the base at Tabuk. So there'll be some friction there, and that will be a further drag on this. But ultimately, those are surmountable because it takes a 2/3 resolution override congressional arms sales, or a presidential arms sale.
All right. Thank you. Dr. Thafer, I wanted to turn back to you. You were going through some of the major deals that were announced in each of these three countries. And at Politico, we're hearing some anxiety among Republican China hawks in particular, looking at just how much Trump's outreach to the Gulf is going to affect China's foothold in the region, particularly companies like the UAE's G42. Last year, they had a deal with Microsoft. They had to kind of walk back some of the terms of that deal over concerns in Congress that the G42 company had too many ties to China. Do you see any signs that the U.S. expanding its cooperation with Gulf countries would come at the expense of China, would displace China in some of these tech relationships?
Well, I think in general, even if you look at Trump's speech, I think, what I took away from it is some of the things that he didn't say in his speech. And I think his trip was mainly about countering China, strategically speaking. And I think most of his moves show that. And I think, you can debate how you can counter China now. For example, the U.S. could withhold the technology, and that would save, and de-risk the possibility of technology transfers to China in many regards. But if you talk about what is he called? What is he? The tech guy, the guy who was the tech guru for Trump. I forgot his name. David. Yeah, David said. Yeah, the tech czar. That's what I'm looking for. So I mean, they thought they would argue that putting safeguards on this technology and sharing the technology would allow the U.S. to establish technological preeminence in the region, and so that is a debate, and that is a risk. And So I think that I don't think there's a right answer when it comes to that from a U.S. policy perspective. I think you have to weigh the costs and the benefits and make the decisions in that way. But I would have to say that I know that every time there is a void from the U.S., China comes in and fills that void. So if there is a tech void, I'm pretty confident that China would try to fill that tech void. And therefore, I think that's why Trump went forward with this strategy. And so you went into one of my points that I had about tech transfers and digital infrastructure. And you rightly pointed out about G42. And I think the UAE showed that it is willing to compromise in terms of G42, in terms of its engagement with China. And what I'm seeing from the Gulf states is that they are trying to kind of create a binary, if you will, in how they engage technologically speaking. So from my understanding and reading in between the lines is that they're looking at like critical infrastructure and security issues. They're looking at it going more towards the U.S. and more like civilian related technologies that are not critical. They're leaning towards China. I still think there could be a lot of research done about that, but I think that's an important takeaway from reading about it. And I think if you look at Gulf research and development, I think it's leaning more towards a U.S. aligned innovation ecosystem, because I think the innovation ecosystem is very similar, I think, to the missile defense system, in which, if you don't have every aspect of the system integrated, then the whole system is not fully usable. So the same thing with technology. If you don't have the complete ecosystem and you have two separate ecosystem systems, one a Chinese one or one an American one, it's very hard to run the ecosystem. Right now, it looks like it's leaning American. But there were other issues that are important to highlight in regards to China. One is, I think the main criticism of the U.S., and it's always been, is that the U.S. is very heavy in terms of security. And I've had even generals of the Pentagon, for example, say that, when they go to the region, people always say the Chinese people are coming with a suit and making business deals, and the Americans are coming in military uniform. And at this point, Trump, I think, changed that engagement. So he's looking at creating some sort of economic interdependence, which has been kind of the win for China, because China has been known for having significant economic interdependence when it comes to the Gulf states, and that was China's strength. Another interesting thing was the discussions about civil nuclear cooperation. And I think, even though the discussions were opened, and from my understanding, no agreement has been made, I think the U.S. is moving to preempt China infrastructure entrenchment, because the Chinese and the Russians have talked about and proposed having civil nuclear programs in the Gulf. And then another point, which I already made, but I still want to make it, like the critical minerals component, to me is the most interesting thing about this whole trip, because China controls 70 to 90% of rare earth refining. And so Trump has signed an MOU with Saudi Arabia for mining, processing, and refining, and research and development collaboration, which I think is interesting, not only in Saudi Arabia, but in other regions of the world. And then I haven't spoken a lot about regional politics, and that's usually my topic. You can't help but think about, the U.S. trying to outflank China if you look at important regional files. If you look at Syria, I think the idea was, of course, the Trump administration and probably most of the Gulf states are not very pleased with HTS leadership with Al-Qaeda backgrounds in Syria, leading Syria. But at the same time, I think they learned from the days of the Arab Spring, when you have these vacuums, they're going to be filled with other actors. And one actor that they don't want there is Iran. But also from the U.S. side, they don't want China to go in there and start getting all of these infrastructure contracts in Syria. In Syria, yes. Sorry if I wasn't clear about that. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the port, which I always forget the name of it, and this reminds me, what's the name? Oh, Tartus. Yes, I always say Tartur. Addis told me that Tartur means a man that's dependent on his wife too much. So I always I had a podcast this morning, and I tried to avoid saying Tartur. But anyways, so Tartus is a port that the UAE has already signed an $800 million deal to develop this port. And that is a port that Russia has a strategic placement there. And so as you can see, they're trying to displace Russia and China when it comes to Syria policy. Also, I think, obviously they want to have an Iran deal because it's like Brian rightly pointed out, that it's like a choking point for all regional security. And so that is important. But also, I think breaking Iran's reliance totally on China. And I kind of think he's trying to break everyone's reliance slowly with China. Like even his engagement with Russia and his long conversations with Putin, indicate that he's kind of trying to bring them away and isolate China in his politics. So I would argue that. And then his ceasefire deal with the Houthis, I think, was significant because one, China went ahead and made a deal directly with the Houthis to have their ships attacked. And while the U.S. and everyone else is getting attacked, and securing the waterways is a core U.S. interest, so that one doesn't allow China to have that advantage. But two, it could be a way to blunt Chinese port access because the Red Sea is very strategic in terms of even economic engagement. And I just see in conclusion, I would say that the U.S. also tried to fill any empty spots that would allow China to encrypt into the region. And I found that to be a very interesting takeaway from the trip.
A much more muscular activist approach to the Gulf. Brian, I wanted to kind of follow that Iran thread with you.
Sure.
What do you think it would take for Saudi Arabia to get more interested in getting on board with an Iran deal? And does the ceasefire deal with the Houthis indicate anything about that question?
So it's really interesting. I think if you look at Saudi Arabia today in 2025 and its posture vis-a-vis Iran, it's light years away from where it was 10 years ago in 2014, 15, 16. They are very much on the path of de-escalation. In March of 2023, China famously took credit for the deal that reopened ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And it's not because the current Saudi leadership loves the Islamic Republic of Iran's leadership anymore these days, because it's the same leadership. It's that circumstances have changed. One of the impacts of Trump's first term, his maximum pressure approach on Iran, was actually to lead to more insecurity in the region. And people don't recognize this because we live in a town and in a time when narratives and political narratives actually take hold even in analysts' brains. But the popular narrative coming from sort of the Trump teams was that, well, the JCPOA gave all this cash to Iran and they used all this cash to then wreak havoc in the region. When you actually line it up and see the amounts of attacks that Saudi Arabia was suffering, including the attack on Abqaiq in 2019, the deadliest, not deadliest, but biggest attack on an oil refinery on Trump's watch, and there was no response. And there's complicated reasons for that, but essentially under Donald Trump, the message was sent louder and clearer than Barack Obama did, that you're on your own. that you countries, yes, will sell you weapons. Yes, we'll even deploy troops as Biden did during the insecurity with Iran and the 2 exchanges between Iran and Israel last year. But in essence, you've got to do more to pull your weight. So bottom line, and not to ramble here, is that the regime, the leadership in Saudi Arabia, same people who had very frosty relations with those in Iran, they themselves are in the middle of this Vision 2030 and rebuilding and reforming their social and economic model at home. They do not want to see any sort of conflict that threatens their stability. I think the same goes certainly for Qatar, Oman, and the UAE. And that may pose a challenge for the Trump administration strategically, because the gap between where the Gulf states are right now and where the current Israeli government is on the questions of Iran and on Palestine are quite substantial. And at this point, I don't see a figure in this current administration that is poised to try to mediate those potential gaps. And the scenario I'm trying to paint here, which seems quite likely, if you want to follow a really good analyst on Iran, listen to my colleague Alex Vatanka, Middle East Institute Iran scholar, senior fellow. He's got a steady view on this. We were just talking about this at a team meeting earlier today, that if you look at the signals being sent in the media, but then privately, this is going to be tougher, perhaps, to get a deal than Trump's efforts to get peace in Ukraine, right? Remember when he said it was 24 hours and that'll get done. So long story short is I think Saudis will welcome it. On the Houthi part of it, I think the Saudis very much post-2020, and we talk a little bit about the Qatar boycott and that sort of frosty period, 2017 to 2020, but they're much more cautious right now, and they've engaged the Houthis diplomatically, and they would prefer to see a pathway there. I see, and maybe David, Dania have different views. I'm not cynical about the value of the Trump separate deal with the Houthis between the U.S. and the Houthis. And again, this was brokered by Oman while I was in Oman during that visit. Had nothing to do with it, but heard about it. I have met the Houthis before. I wouldn't put a lot of stock in the stability of that deal, given who I know, what they are, and what they do to their own people. But it is a signal, and I would close on this, is something that you asked David about the positioning on the weapon sales in Israel. I actually think if I'm sitting in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and in Netanyahu's circles right now, I'm a little worried. I'm worried about the separate deal, because the Houthis, right after the deal was announced, said, we're going to continue attacking Israel, and they announced a naval blockade of Haifa, whatever that means from where they're at. But the Adon Alexander separate deal that Steve Witkoff pursued. The Syria thing that we talked about, Ahmed Ashar. And it's not just the fact that he's got these ties to jihadist groups. It's also that essentially since he got into power as the de facto leader, Israel's been pounding the hell out of Syria on a nearly daily basis because they see security threats there. There are gaps that need to be mediated on that front. But the biggest one, going back to your question, will be the Iran element. Because even if they grab the golden ring here and get something to akin to what most people assess will be not all that dissimilar to the 2015 JCPOA. Maybe they'll call it the TCPOA, the Trump Comprehensive Plan of Action, and rebrand it like they did with NAFTA and things like this. But it's a long road away, I think, to actually getting the Iranians to agree if you look at the differences in terms and things like that. But bottom line, I think the Gulf would welcome anything that moves towards a pathway of diplomacy as opposed to a pathway to war. Much different Saudi Arabia. Close on this one. And Mohammed bin Salman would come to the United States, and his last visit, he actually would say publicly and privately, Saudi Arabia is Nazi Germany. That's like a quote. He had that one message. We got to deal with Nazi Germany. They're a threat to the region. And his second message was, come invest in Saudi Arabia, which is right next to Nazi Germany. And a lot of business executives were like, wait, what's going on here? And to draw all these threads together, that dissonance, the fact that it feels like it's much more stable today just because the president had a 3-day, 4-day journey with business deals. But the underlying dynamics, when you add up Palestine and Iran, are actually quite shaky, in my view. The fact that Iran and Israel went after each other directly. And yes, the U.S. played a role in that, but it's not a stable environment. And this could be, in many ways, this trip, depending on how things unfold in the Middle East, it could be viewed as this brief calm before a bigger storm that hit the region.
I'm going to ask a question to David DeRoche, but before I do that, I know everybody's got cards on their chairs, and I wonder how are we collecting those cards so that we can get some feedback from the audience?
You always let to know.
Okay, super.
So it was pass them down towards me. It all would great.
Okay, cool. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask you a question, David.
I'll answer more short, but
So yeah.
Well, actually, kind of referencing the slides of hardware that we saw in planes, what do you make of the jet that Qatar is rumored to be giving the U.S.? Is that happening?
it's less likely now than it was before. The issue is they need a 747 frame. They need something that's roughly fitted out. Boeing isn't making 747s anymore. The program is, I think, 10 years behind. I'm not sure about the current flight worthiness, but of the current 747s. Theoretically, it's a good solution engineering wise, but there's a well-established narrative by Trump's opponents of his avariciousness. The fact that people are presenting this as a bribe or mention the emoluments clause, for a gift that's being accepted on behalf of the U.S. Air Force, that indicates to me that they either don't understand what an emolument is or there's some dissimulation or disingenuousness going on there. I think that it's less likely than it was 3 weeks ago. I think that President Trump talking about it makes it less likely to happen. And I think at some point he'll just say, okay, this is a bad look. But if I were just making the engineering case as a U.S. taxpayer with a neutral president, I'd say, yeah, why not? This is something we need. It will take a long time to retrofit this to a presidential configuration. There's a lot of communications and protection stuff needs to be done. So I think it's less likely.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, I get your point on bribe and things like this, but let's not ignore the bigger picture here. And it's not a partisan statement. This is factual. Not on the plane itself. You've got your views, but the latest news that the Trump team shopped themselves and asked if they could get this as a gift is one thing. The second thing, and I've written about this before, and let's be clear, we're here in America. We can disagree on all of this. But the fact that before, during, and then likely after, we have a president of the United States who has a personal business, a family business, where his sons are actually out there cutting deals, highly unusual. And when we talk about sort of the Biden team and the corruption and things like this, but it's not just him. It's his top envoy, Steve Witkoff, who has deep ties to all of these countries. The Qatar bailed his failed enterprises out before. And his son, a week or two in advance, when I was out in the region in Oman, cutting deals for their own family businesses. And again, it is what it is, but it should be part of our debate and discourse. And it's noteworthy to me, notwithstanding the jet offer or whatever's going on there, that there are at least some voices in both parties. It's not just a Democrat or Republican issue. There are Republicans in this age of age, 3 months in or 4 months in, who are actually showing a little bit of a spine for the first time early in this administration. It could be because his political honeymoon was over, right? I've written about this in advance of this trip. Trump became underwater politically here at home. So maybe people smell blood in the water. But the point is not about the plane. The point is the broader ecosystem of deal making where you've got, in essence, and last thing I'd say on this is a top leader at the start of the first Trump administration said that we see in President Trump a man who's easily flattered. And we will flatter him and personally and try to enrich him and his families. And we as Americans, I think, need to keep that as part of the debate. Understand that this is part of probably what's going on. There's a lot of good with AI deals and things that could benefit Americans, maybe, but it will certainly benefit the Trump family enterprise. That's the point I'd like to make. And
No. I mean, when I said that there's a narrative of avariciousness that this fits into, that's there. Yeah, I mean, part of the problem we have, there's a bigger question in the United States, which is it at all possible for a businessman to be involved in politics actively? I mean, when you look at our past precedents, past couple of years, we've had career politicians, community organizers, and I think that the hotel across the street, was that a bribe? That clearly people stayed there hoping that they. That's a bigger philosophical issue, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to hash it out, but. Yeah, I mean, we're both in Oman at the same time. There's a Trump golf course going in there, and people you know, it's not an Arnold Palmer course, and it's not a Jack Nicklaus course. So there might be a reason for that. And that's something we need to figure out as a nation.
And again, and I don't take it as a partisan or ideological screed. I'm just saying as a checks and balances, and we should be aware.
Yeah.
You know, I know people who work as federal government employees, I think as you are, who need to file. And I'm saying keep things sort of in order and file what your assets are and who benefits from this. It should be part of the debate, and it's natural. And if we're not, we're actually deluding people in just simply saying this is normal.
Can I raise
It's
some
really-
interjections here about, let's see, this? So a couple points. Yes, I do remember when I worked at the National Defense University, I could never accept any gifts, and I only kept their boxes, which was not cool. But I have to say, yeah, so I have a bunch of empty boxes from even Gulf countries.
Yeah, locker full of watches.
If you guys, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But anyways, there's some other points I think I would like to do to balance this discussion a little bit. First, you know, I think from like if you're sitting in from the perspective of the Qataris, $400 million is a lot cheaper than a blockade, you know, and I think that the Qataris felt like, okay, well, I'm just gonna spend this money, but to me, it's cheaper than having any other political ramifications, and I won't go further into that point. Um, uh, the other point is, and probably it's not going to be a very popular point, but I will say that the U.S. has been gifted by other governments before. So the question is this a gift to the U.S. or is this a gift to Trump? If you look at the cherry blossoms here, I mean, they're a gift from Japan. If you look at the Statue of Liberty, it was also a gift to the U.S. And so I don't want to get into this debate because this is also a slippery slope. But, you know, how much of like these kind of responses are related because the money came from like an Arab I mean, these gifts came from an Arab nation versus other nations. How much of that is embedded in this discussion? I'm not sure. But also, I do remember when I worked in the government, we were not allowed to have gifts of any worth more than $50 or $60. I don't remember what it was.
Well, Smithsonian is.
Let's carry on. Let's go to another topic.
Make one point about the Statue of Liberty, which was actually
No, you're-
re-gifted. So that was designed, that's supposed to be an Egyptian peasant woman. It was designed to be at the entrance of the Suez Canal, but it went bankrupt. So it actually, to square the Arab circle, that is an Egyptian woman that was re-gifted to us by the French when it went bankrupt. They had nothing to sell. So yeah.
All right. This actually is a question for you, David. And it's from someone, we've got Faris Aman in the audience. Aman, Johns Hopkins University. You highlighted on F-35s that Huawei's 5G infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and the UAE is a primary obstacle to progress on a procurement deal. Some European countries have Huawei infrastructure while operating F-35s. What are the lessons or guardrails that Gulf countries can adopt to be able to purchase F-35? And I might just add a little bit more. Is there any U.S. push for the Gulf to rip and replace Huawei infrastructure?
Well, there is. Yeah. I mean, this was an issue in the Biden administration. If you look 3 years ago, if you look at Colin Kahl's address at the Manama Dialogue, he kind of did this explicitly. So I'm using this as an example. I knew that question would come from you, by the way. So I'm using this as a for example. The broader issue, and I can't speak to what specific infrastructure is there, but imagine an AM radio where you get bad reception. Then when you walk close to it, the reception cleans up. The same thing happens here. If you have anything that emits and receives in close proximity to the plane, then eventually you'll figure out what that signature is, and that will compromise stuff. So there's some stuff that is okay. There's other stuff that is not okay. But, you know, this was the issue, one of the issues with the UAE, which was they were like, well, you know, it's cellular structure. Who cares? And the answer is, well, cellular structure was what enabled the Serbs to bring down an F-117, which is also a stealth aircraft. So and normally we're the guys that are stovepipe. In their instance, they're like, well, this is commercial infrastructure, which says, well, you don't know how the Chinese work. That, you know, there's nothing there. So it's a broader issue. I can't point to a specific capability. Just let me say, there's a whole range of capabilities that our Gulf clients and our European clients regard as commercial that have military interactions, and we know that the way the Chinese government works, a Chinese company will not tell the Chinese government, sorry, that intersects our business. We won't cooperate with you on that. So I probably went into more depth in my initial remarks than that. Take it as a for example.
I've got a question for Brian. This is from Lena in the audience. Lena asks, the UK, France, and Canada released a joint statement yesterday condemning Israel today. The UK released a statement putting sanctions and halting a deal, or I think suggesting sanctions perhaps, and halting a trade deal with Israel. Given these pushes for a ceasefire agreement and possible behind-the-scenes discussions between Trump and Qatar, UAE, Saudi, how possible is a ceasefire agreement? And also, Brian, we've been hearing a bit of a different tone from Trump this week,
Yeah.
kind of indicating a lack of patience and more sympathy for the Palestinians in Gaza. Do you think the Gulf leaders were talking to him? And
Oh, for sure. Like, so there was the public facing, which we all saw. And then this is why I was curious, and I raised this 2-hour meeting with the Emir. For sure, he heard about all of this. And to me, it's blatantly obvious why. Let's just hit rewind on what happened here. There was a ceasefire deal that it took more than a year, actually, because this first ceasefire was November 2023, and about half the hostages got out, and there was a ceasefire for about a week. And then it took a long time, and it took the combination of the Biden team exiting, working in coordination with the Trump team coming in, and Steve Witkoff, to get to a ceasefire that was in place when Trump came into office. It's a 3-phase ceasefire, and by all accounts, a number of things scuttled things from phase 1 to phase 2. Phase 2 wasn't even begun. And like everything on Israel-Palestine, the finger pointing and the 10 sides to every story are there. But simple fact of the matter is you get two entities, Israel and Hamas, who see themselves in an existential fight. And God bless the negotiators that try to get them to agree to something, to stick to it. My take on it is that phase 2 never really was intended to come to fruition. The current Israeli government and the prime minister has his own difficulties there. What made it difficult was also the awful pomp and circumstance with which hostages were released by Hamas in February. Unseemly, gaunt hostages, and this sort of caused problems there too. So, but I don't think the Trump team really tried. They tried a little bit from getting from phase 1 to phase 2, but this is extremely difficult to get these two entities to move together. Trump's tone has shifted. Why has it shifted? Because Israel, in essence, ended the ceasefire in mid-March. You could say, okay, well, Hamas was part of that, and certainly it was, and its actions didn't do benefit for the Palestinian people of Gaza. But there's been a siege where starvation, and this is episodic, it comes out, and there was a siege, and I have friends who I talk to on WhatsApp and regularly, people who are dear friends of mine who live in Gaza and had moved 5-6 times. Can't imagine what their lives are like. I can imagine a little bit because they tell me. So what Trump was hearing and his team was hearing in advance of this was what was the obvious, is that the siege of no food going in, gangs, Hamas, and others controlling access to this was starting to lead to some of the images. And if anything, we know this from Trump in his first term. He's an image guy. He's actually seared by human suffering. You remember the strikes in Syria he conducted because of the sarin gas attacks? It was strikes without strategy, but he is moved by these things. Will this mean that there's going to be a new sort of pathway to a ceasefire? I highly doubt it. I hope so, because the people of Gaza and the Palestinians, but also the Israelis, need some sort of recourse besides war. Those who have hostage family members in Gaza held by Hamas want a pathway out. We see it every day in that system that Israel has, its democracy, where people are fighting every day in the streets and protesting against this government because they don't see leadership. So long story short is there's so much as we see what Trump has tried to do, half-heartedly, I think, with Ukraine and Russia. And I think it's a similar scenario. If the parties cannot come together, and if the U.S. does not want to invest the serious diplomatic muscle to actually get this moving forward, it took the Biden team far too long to get to the deal at the end of their term. And I hope that they get a pathway, but the thing that's blocking it is the lack of leadership inside of Israel and inside the Palestinian community in Gaza to actually put the people rather than the causes over sort of their own personal agendas there. So.
I know we're coming to the end of our time, and so I'm going to end with a question to you, Dr. Thafer, which is kind of taking us away from these three Gulf countries and putting one more on the table. This is a question from Kathleen Davy Mystery. Yeah, hope I'm pronouncing that right. And she asks, what role will Oman play with future trade development in the region? Notably, I'm not on this itinerary. Are they going to be engaging with the Trump administration in the same way?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that Oman will be engaging with the Trump administration in different ways, though. I mean, Oman is not as wealthy as these three states that were visited. So, I mean, if you're going to talk about investments into the U.S., I'm not too optimistic about that. But in terms of engagement on the diplomatic front, I think, Iran has been center and stage. Iran has been facilitating the talks with Iran. They facilitated the truce with the Houthis. And so I think they will continue to be, active, but maybe in different ways than, all this deal signing that happened between Trump and the other two GCC states.
So possibly another way of providing value besides $2 trillion of investment.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being here and for hearing this panel out. I think we've got some refreshments outside. Is that right?
There is, yes.
Yes. And I want to thank our panelists again, David DeRoche, Brian Katulis, Dania Thafer. Thank you all so much.
Oops.